I was sitting on my back porch with a cold beer when I noticed three people I'd never seen before casting fishing lines into my pond. My private pond. The one that sat squarely in the middle of my 5-acre property in rural Virginia, about 20 miles outside of Charlottesville. I set down my beer and walked toward them, confused, more than angry at first. "Hey there," I called out as I approached. "Can I help you folks?" A middle-aged man in a floppy fishing hat turned to me with a friendly smile. "Beautiful day for fishing, isn't it? We got our permits from the HOA office this morning. $20 each, but totally worth it for a pond this nice?" I stopped walking. "I'm sorry, what? Permits from who?" "The Homeowners Association," a woman next to him chimed in. She held up a laminated card. "See? Official fishing permit for Meadowbrook Estates Community Pond, valid for the whole season." My jaw clenched. I'd moved to this property 6 months ago, specifically because it wasn't part of any HOA. The previous owner had made that abundantly clear during the sale. The house sat on land that predated the surrounding subdivision by decades, and I'd paid a premium for that independence. "This isn't a community pond," I said, keeping my voice level. "This is my private property, all 5 acres, including every drop of water in that pond." The three fishermen exchanged glances. The first man's smile faded. "But the HOA lady said this was part of the community amenities. We paid good money for these permits." "I don't care what anyone told you," I replied. "You're trespassing on private property. I'm going to need you to leave." They packed up quickly, apologizing and muttering about getting their money back. I watched them trudge back toward the subdivision that bordered my eastern property line, then pulled out my phone and looked up the Meadowbrook Estates HOA contact information. It didn't take long to find. The next morning, I drove to the address listed on their website. It was a small office tucked into a strip mall, sandwiched between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. A sign on the door read, "Meadowbrook Estates HOA, by appointment only." I walked in anyway. A woman sat behind a desk, probably in her late 40s, with the kind of haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She looked up from her computer with an expression that suggested my mere existence was an inconvenience. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she'd rather not. "I'm Adam Aldridge. I own the property at 1247 Old Mill Road." "That's not part of our association," she said dismissively, already looking back at her screen. "I know that, but apparently you've been selling fishing permits to access my private pond." Her fingers stopped typing. She looked at me again, this time with a thin smile. "The pond is clearly visible from community property. Our legal counsel has determined that it falls under recreational easement laws." "Recreational easement laws," I repeated. "That's not a thing. Not for private property that has no legal connection to your subdivision." "Mr. Aldridge, I'm Karen Mitchell, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. I've been managing this community for 8 years. I think I know a bit more about property law than you do." There it was. The condescension dripped from every word. I'd dealt with people like Karen before, the type who confused authority with actual power. "Show me the easement paperwork," I said. That's confidential HOA business." "Then stop selling access to my property, or I'll take legal action." Karen stood up, somehow managing to look down at me even though I was taller. "Mr. Aldridge, this community has enjoyed access to that pond for years. The previous owner never complained. If you want to come in here making threats, you'll find that we have very good lawyers." "So do I," I said, turning to leave. "You're officially notified. Stop selling those permits." As I walked out, I heard her say something under her breath about difficult people, but I was already planning my next move. Back home, I pulled out my property survey, deed, and title insurance documents. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My property lines were clearly defined, and the pond sat well within them. There was no easement, no right-of-way, no legal gray area. It was my land, my pond, my property. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, who'd handled the purchase of the house. He listened to my story and sighed. "These HOA disputes can get messy," he said, "but you're clearly in the right. The question is whether you want to pursue this formally." "What are my options?" "Well, if they continue after you've notified them, you can sue for trespassing, seek an injunction, and potentially claim damages for the unauthorized commercial use of your property. But that takes time and money. What if I just started billing them? I asked. Marcus paused. Billing them? They're selling permits for $20 each. What if I invoice them for the use of my property? Set up a paper trail showing that I never authorized this, that I've repeatedly told them to stop, and that every permit they sell is generating revenue from my property without my consent? I could hear the smile in Marcus's voice. That's actually clever. You'd be documenting their continued infringement while establishing a clear record of the property's commercial value. If it goes to court, you'd have receipts for every violation. Can you draft something official looking? I can do better than that. I'll send you a template for a proper commercial invoice. Include your property details, the dates, and a clear statement that these charges represent unauthorized commercial use. Send it certified mail so they can't claim they never received it. Over the next week, I set up a surveillance camera aimed at the pond. It wasn't paranoia, it was documentation. Sure enough, I counted at least 15 different people fishing there over the course of 5 days. I made notes of dates, times, and how many people I saw. Then, I drafted my first invoice. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Invoice. Adam Aldridge, property owner, 1247 Old Mill Road. 2. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, unauthorized commercial use of private property. For the period of dates, your organization has sold fishing permits granting access to property located at 1247 Old Mill Road without authorization from the property owner. This invoice represents fees for said unauthorized commercial use. Number of observed permit holders, 47 rate per permit, matching your sales price, $20, subtotal, $940. Additional commercial licensing fee for unauthorized business operation on private property, $2,000. Total. Due, $2,940. Payment due within 30 days. I sent it certified mail and waited. The response came faster than I expected. A letter from a law firm in Charlottesville, Barton & Associates, arrived 5 days later. It was full of legal language essentially saying that I was harassing their client, that the HOA had every right to manage community resources, and that I should cease my frivolous demands immediately. I forwarded the letter to Marcus. They're bluffing, he said when I called. They know they're wrong, so they're trying to intimidate you. Here's what we do. We respond with a letter from my firm laying out the legal facts, and we file for an injunction. We'll also send a cease and desist that's actually enforceable. Do it, I said. But I didn't stop there. I decided to visit some of the people I'd seen fishing at my pond. The subdivision had a community Facebook group that wasn't hard to find. I created an account and posted, "Hi neighbors, I'm Adam Aldridge, owner of the property at 1247 Old Mill Road. If you've purchased a fishing permit from the HOA for the pond on my property, please reach out. I have information you should know about the legitimacy of those permits." The responses came quickly. Some were hostile, accusing me of being selfish and anti-community. But several people sent private messages expressing confusion. They'd paid for annual permits, some as much as $150. One message stood out. It was from a man named Robert Torres who lived 3 streets over. "Mr. Aldridge, I paid $150 for a family annual fishing permit. My kids love that pond. Are you saying the HOA doesn't actually have the right to sell these?" I called him that evening. Robert seemed like a decent guy, frustrated that he'd been misled. "The HOA never owned that property," I explained. "They have no legal right to sell access to it. I'm not trying to be difficult, but it's my land. I never gave permission for any of this. So what happens to the money we paid?" "That's between you and the HOA. But if I were you, I'd demand a refund. They sold you something they had no right to sell." Robert was quiet for a moment. "There are a lot of families who bought these permits. Karen Mitchell told us it was a new community benefit she'd negotiated, said it would bring property values up." "She lied," I said flatly. "Can I share your number with some other people? I think they'd want to hear this directly from you." Over the next few days, I spoke with nearly 20 people who'd bought permits. The amounts varied. Some had paid $20 for day passes, others had paid for monthly or seasonal access, a few had bought the annual family permits. When I added it all up, Karen and the HOA had collected over $4,000 selling access to property they didn't own. That's when I sent my second invoice. This one was itemized differently. Invoice 2, Adam Aldridge, property owner. To Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, continued unauthorized commercial use of private property despite formal notification and legal cease and desist. Documented permit sales based on direct testimony from purchasers. 47 previously documented permits, $940. Additional 23 verified permits, $460. Monthly commercial licensing fee for operating business on private property without authorization, $5,000. Total for current period, $5,460. Previous balance, due, $2,940, total amount due, $8,400. I added a note at the bottom. All permit holders have been informed that these permits are invalid and were sold without legal authority. Continued sale of such permits will result in additional charges and formal legal action, including claims for fraud and theft. This time, the response wasn't a lawyer's letter. It was Karen herself showing up at my front door on a Saturday morning. I saw her through the window, standing on my porch with her arms crossed. I took my time answering. "Mr. Aldridge," she said the moment I opened the door, "this has gone far enough. You're causing problems for an entire community over a pond that people have been enjoying for years without issue." "Without your issue," I corrected. "It was always an issue for me because it's my property. The previous owner never complained." "I'm not the previous owner, and for all you know, they didn't know you were doing this either." Karen's expression hardened. "I've spoken with our attorneys. They assure me that we have a strong case for established use. There's precedent for community access when something has been treated as a public resource for an extended period. That's called adverse possession, and it requires specific legal conditions that definitely aren't met here. I've owned this property for 6 months. You'd need years, openly and continuously, without permission. And I just revoked any implicit permission the moment I found out. Your lawyers are feeding you nonsense to keep collecting their fees." "You're being unreasonable," she snapped. "These are families, children who want to fish. You're really going to be that person?" I leaned against the doorframe. "Karen, you're charging these families money. You're running a business using my property. If you want to talk about being unreasonable, let's talk about how you're profiting from land you don't own without ever asking permission." "We've made improvements to the access path," she said, changing tactics. "Our maintenance crew has cleared brush, installed railings. We've invested in making that area safe and accessible. On my property, without permission. That's still trespassing, and now you're admitting to making unauthorized modifications to private property." Her face flushed red. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers." "Looking forward to it," I said, and closed the door. But Karen wasn't done. Over the next week, I noticed an increase in people at the pond. When I reviewed my camera footage, I counted over 30 different individuals. It was as if the HOA had decided to escalate rather than back down. I documented everything, every person, every day, every time. I started a spreadsheet, and I sent invoice number 3. This one was for $12,000. Marcus called me when he received his copy. "Adam, I appreciate the strategy here, but you might be getting a bit aggressive with the numbers." "They're getting aggressive with the trespassing," I countered. "They're deliberately sending more people to establish some kind of pattern of use. I'm not going to let them build a case through sheer obstinance." "Fair enough, but be prepared for this to get ugly." It got ugly faster than either of us expected. The following Tuesday, I came home from work to find a citation on my door from the County Code Enforcement Office. According to the notice, I was in violation of local ordinances for restricting public access to a designated recreational water resource and for failure to maintain required safety measures at a public use water feature. I called the county office immediately. "This is Adam Aldridge. I just received a citation for my property at 1247 Old Mill Road. There's been some kind of mistake. The pond on my property isn't a public recreational resource." The woman on the phone, who identified herself as Linda, sounded sympathetic but bureaucratic. "Sir, We have documentation from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA indicating that the pond has been designated as a community resource since 2019. They provided records of maintenance, safety inspections, and permit programs. They provided falsified documents, I said, trying to keep my voice level. They don't own that property. I do. They have no authority to designate anything. Do you have your property deed available? Yes, and a survey and title insurance documents. I'd suggest you come to the county office with all of that. We'll need to review the conflicting claims. I made an appointment for the next day and brought Marcus with me. We sat in a small conference room with Linda and her supervisor, a tired-looking man named Jim Peterson, who seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. We've got the HOA's documentation here, Jim said, spreading out several files. They've been filing reports on the pond since 2019, regular maintenance logs, water quality tests, safety inspections. They've been treating it as a community asset for years. Marcus leaned forward. Did anyone from your office ever verify ownership before accepting these filings? Jim shifted uncomfortably. The HOA is a registered entity with the county. We generally accept their filings regarding community properties in good faith. Except this isn't community property, Marcus said. He slid my property deed across the table. This clearly shows the boundaries of Mr. Aldridge's private property, which fully encompasses the pond in question. The HOA has no ownership stake, no easement, no legal right to anything on this land. Linda examined the documents carefully. These boundaries are pretty clear. Jim, I think we need to rescind the citation. We'll need to investigate further, Jim said, but he looked nervous now. While you investigate, Marcus continued, you should be aware that the HOA has been operating a commercial enterprise on my client's private property without permission. They've been selling permits, collecting fees, and representing to the public that they have authority over this land. That's fraud and potentially theft. We don't handle criminal matters, Jim said quickly. But you do handle accurate record keeping, Marcus replied. And right now, your records contain false information that's being used to support an illegal operation. I'd suggest correcting that quickly before you become liable as well. We left the office with a promise that the citation would be withdrawn and the HOA's filings would be corrected. But I could tell this was just another front in an expanding war. That weekend, I decided to install a proper gate at the point where the worn path from the subdivision crossed onto my property. Nothing fancy, just a simple metal farm gate with a lock and clear private property, no trespassing signs. I was setting the posts when Karen appeared with two other people, a man and a woman I didn't recognize. What do you think you're doing? Karen demanded. Installing a gate on my property, I said without looking up. You can't block community access, the man said. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with the kind of posture that suggested he was used to being obeyed. I'm Richard Henderson, HOA legal counsel. I stopped working and straightened up. The same legal counsel who told Karen she had a case? You might want to get a second opinion. Mr. Aldridge, you're creating a hostile environment for an entire community. There are legal remedies for this kind of behavior. Such as? We can pursue a claim that your actions constitute a private nuisance. We can seek damages for the economic impact on property values. We can file complaints with every relevant county office until you're buried in bureaucratic paperwork. I looked at him for a long moment. You're threatening to weaponize government bureaucracy because I won't let you steal from me. Do you hear yourself? The woman spoke up. She was younger, maybe early 30s, with an expensive-looking suit. Mr. Aldridge, I'm Jennifer Wu. I sit on the HOA board. We're trying to find a reasonable solution here. What if we worked out an agreement? We could pay you a licensing fee for community access. Finally, something resembling sense. How much have you collected in permit fees so far? Jennifer glanced at Karen, who said nothing. Roughly, I pressed. About $4,500, Jennifer admitted. For access to property you don't own and never had permission to use, I said. That's not a licensing fee situation. That's theft. You stole my property rights and monetized them. That's a very aggressive characterization, Richard said. Isbah. It's an accurate one. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop selling permits immediately. You're going to issue refunds to everyone who bought them. You're going to send a formal letter to all your members explaining that the pond is private property and they have no legal access, and you're going to pay me for the unauthorized use that's already occurred." "We'll do no such thing," Karen said. "Then we go to court, and I add fraud charges to the trespassing and commercial theft." "Your choice." Richard tried to maintain his authoritative demeanor. "If you take this to court, we'll countersue for harassment, for frivolous legal action, for damages to the community. You'll spend years and thousands of dollars fighting this." "Or," I said, "you could just stop doing illegal things and admit you were wrong. Novel concept, I know." They left, but not before Karen promised this wasn't over. Marcus filed the injunction the following week. We requested an emergency hearing given the ongoing nature of the violations. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Caldwell, heard both sides in her chambers. Richard presented his case, arguing that the community had established use, that I was being unreasonable, that families would be harmed by losing access to the pond. He painted me as a cruel outsider, disrupting a peaceful community. Marcus dismantled it methodically. He showed the property documents, the timeline of my ownership, the evidence of the HOA's commercial operation. He presented testimony from permit buyers who'd been told the HOA owned the rights. He showed my invoices and the HOA's refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Judge Caldwell listened to everything, then looked at Richard. "Counselor, does the HOA own this property?" "No, Your Honor, but does the HOA have an easement or any legal right to this property?" "Not explicitly, but the precedent of established use is not applicable here, not remotely." She turned to me. "Mr. Aldridge, you've been incredibly patient. If someone were running a business out of my backyard without permission, I'd have had them arrested." She granted the injunction immediately. The HOA was ordered to cease all activities related to my property, to stop selling permits, to refund all previous purchasers, and to send written notice to the community. She also ordered them to pay my legal fees up to that point, which came to about $3,000. "Furthermore," Judge Caldwell added, "I'm referring this matter to the county attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. Selling access to property you don't own looks a lot like fraud to me." Karen's face went white. Richard tried to argue, but the judge shut him down. "We're done here. You lost. Accept it with whatever grace you can manage. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, someone cut my fence, not the gate I'd installed, but a section of fence along the property line near the pond. I discovered it when I saw 4 people fishing on a Wednesday afternoon. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. "This is private property." One of them, a younger guy in his 20s, shrugged. The fence was down. Figured it was open access now. "The fence was cut. It's still private property. You need to leave." They grumbled but complied. I examined the fence line and found clean-cut marks, bolt cutters probably. This wasn't accidental damage. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report. Deputy Martinez came out, took photos, and wrote everything up. "You think it's the HOA?" he asked. "I know it is. They just lost a court case over this exact issue." "That'd be pretty stupid of them to escalate after a judge ruled against them." "Stupid seems to be their specialty," I said. I repaired the fence and added more cameras. 3 days later, the fence was cut again. This time, I had footage. The video showed a man in dark clothing and a baseball cap approaching with bolt cutters around 2 in the morning. He cut the fence in 3 places, then left. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify him definitively, but I recognized the build and walk. It was Richard Henderson, the HOA's lawyer. I called Marcus immediately. "They're done," he said when he saw the footage. "This crosses from civil dispute into criminal destruction of property, and if their lawyer did it, that's even worse. He could be disbarred." We turned the footage over to the sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez looked almost happy when he saw it. "I hate HOAs," he muttered. "Had one try to find me once for parking my patrol car in my own driveway, said it wasn't aesthetically pleasing." An investigation was opened. Richard Henderson was questioned. At first, he denied everything, but when confronted with the video, he admitted to cutting the fence. His justification was that he was trying to maintain community access during the appeal period. There was no appeal period. The judge's order was final. Richard was arrested and charged with criminal mischief and destruction of property. The story made the local news. HOA lawyer arrested for cutting fence in pond dispute ran as a headline in the Charlottesville Daily Progress. The publicity changed everything. Suddenly, people in the subdivision started really looking at what their HOA board had been doing. The Facebook group exploded with angry posts. People demanded to know where all the permit money had gone. They wanted to see the HOA's financial records. They questioned why their dues were being used to pay lawyers to fight a battle the HOA had no legal grounds to win. Jennifer Wu, the reasonable board member I'd met before, reached out to me directly. "Mr. Aldridge, I owe you an apology. I didn't know the full extent of what Karen had been doing. Several board members didn't. She ran the permit program almost entirely on her own, and the money went into an account we didn't have access to." "An account the HOA didn't control?" I asked. "Exactly. We're discovering that Karen set up what she called a special projects fund that wasn't properly documented. The permit money, along with some other fees she'd collected for various things, went into an account in her name." "That sounds like embezzlement." "That's what our new lawyer says. We've removed her from the board and we're conducting a full audit. Mr. Aldridge, on behalf of the HOA board, I want to formally apologize. We never had any right to your property. We'll pay whatever the court determines we owe you, and we'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again." I appreciated the apology, but I was more interested in seeing this through properly. The county attorney's office opened a formal investigation into Karen's activities. As they dug deeper, they found that the fishing permits were just the beginning. Karen had been charging fees for all sorts of things, from parking enforcement to architectural review applications, and routing portions of that money into her personal account. Over the course of 3 years, she'd diverted nearly $40,000. The arrest came on a Thursday morning. I didn't witness it, but I heard about it from multiple sources within the hour. Karen Mitchell was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft. The bail was set at $50,000. The HOA held an emergency meeting to elect new leadership. Jennifer Wu became the interim president. One of her first acts was to send me a formal written apology and a check for $8,000, representing both the documented permit sales related to my property and a settlement to avoid further legal action. I accepted it, but I also sent one final invoice. This one wasn't for money. Final notice. Adam Aldridge, property owner. 2 Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. This notice confirms receipt of payment and settlement agreement regarding unauthorized use of property at 1247 Old Mill Road. In exchange for the settlement payment and formal written apology, I agree to drop all civil claims against the HOA as an organization. However, this settlement does not extend to individual actors, including but not limited to Karen Mitchell and Richard Henderson, whose criminal actions remain subject to ongoing prosecution. Furthermore, this notice serves as permanent revocation of any access to property at 1247 Old Mill Road by any HOA member, representative, or affiliate. The pond and all surrounding areas are private property. Any future trespassing will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The path previously used to access the pond from the subdivision is closed permanently. The gate and fence line will be maintained and monitored. Thank you for your cooperation in resolving this matter. I sent it certified mail and posted a copy to the community Facebook group. Richard Henderson took a plea deal. He lost his law license and received probation and community service. His legal practice folded within a month. Karen Mitchell went to trial. The prosecution laid out a clear pattern of theft and deception. Former board members testified about how she'd controlled information and operated without oversight. Permit buyers testified about what they'd been told. I testified about the pond and the property dispute. The jury found her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to individuals she'd defrauded. Life got quieter after that. The new HOA board was careful to stay on their side of the property line. They sent out regular reminders to residents that the pond was private property and off-limits. Most people respected it. I did get occasional trespassers, usually kids who didn't know better or new residents who hadn't heard the story. I'd politely but firmly send them on their way. The cameras helped. Once word got around that I had video surveillance, the trespassing dropped to almost nothing. About 6 months after everything settled, I was sitting on my back porch again, enjoying the same view that had started this whole mess. The pond looked beautiful in the late afternoon sun, completely peaceful. My phone rang. It was Jennifer Wu. It was, "Mr. Aldridge, I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to let you know that the HOA just completed our full financial audit and recovery process. We've recovered most of the money Karen stole, and we've implemented new oversight procedures to make sure nothing like this happens again." I also wanted to thank you, oddly enough. Thank me? If you hadn't stood your ground, we might never have discovered what she was doing. She could have continued for years. You forced everything into the light, and while it was painful, it was necessary. So thank you. I appreciate that, Jennifer. For what it's worth, I think you're doing a good job as president. I'm trying, and I promise you, we'll never have this kind of problem again. The new board takes property rights very seriously. After we hung up, I sat back and looked at the pond again. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, frustrating, and expensive, despite winning my legal fees back. But it had been worth it. Not just because I'd protected my property rights, but because I'd exposed corruption and held people accountable. The pond was mine. My land, my water, my choice about who got to use it. That might sound selfish to some people, but there's a principle involved. When you own something, you have the right to decide what happens with it. When someone tries to take that away, whether through force or fraud or bureaucratic manipulation, you have to fight back. Karen had counted on me being too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to push back. She'd gotten away with it for years because previous property owners either didn't notice or didn't care enough to fight. She'd built a little empire of petty theft and power tripping, and she'd used people's desire to avoid conflict as her shield. But I'd called her bluff, and the whole house of cards collapsed. I finished my beer and headed inside. Tomorrow I'd go fishing in my own pond, on my own property, without having to ask anyone's permission or pay anyone's fee. That thought made me smile. The legal aftermath continued for months in small ways. Insurance companies fought over who had to pay what. The HOA's insurance initially denied coverage because Karen's actions were criminal rather than negligent. That led to another round of legal wrangling that didn't involve me, but that I heard about through Jennifer. The subdivision also had to deal with the fallout among residents. Some people were angry at Karen and Richard for their actions. Others were angry at me for not just letting the community use the pond. There were heated debates at HOA meetings about community values versus property rights. One resident, a retired teacher named Margaret, even started a petition asking me to voluntarily allow limited fishing access. It got about 40 signatures. I politely declined through a brief email, explaining that the principle wasn't negotiable. My property wasn't a community resource just because people wanted it to be. A few weeks after that, a local newspaper reporter called requesting an interview for a story about HOA overreach. I agreed, figuring the more people who heard about cases like this, the better. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Kim, met me at a coffee shop in Charlottesville. She'd done her homework, bringing copies of court documents and news articles about the case. "Mr. Aldridge, from the outside, some people see this as a conflict between individual property rights and community benefit. How do you respond to people who say you were being selfish?" I considered the question carefully. I'd say they're missing the fundamental issue. This wasn't about whether fishing access is good for the community. It was about whether an HOA can take someone's property rights and monetize them without permission. If I'd voluntarily offered access, that would be my choice. But Karen decided she had the right to make that choice for me and to profit from it. That's not community spirit. That's theft. The HOA argued they'd made improvements to the access area and that residents had been using the pond for years. Making improvements to someone else's property without permission is still trespassing. As for the years of use, that happened before I owned the property, and I have no way of knowing if the previous owner actually consented or even knew about it. Regardless, I didn't consent, and I clearly communicated that the moment I discovered what was happening. Sarah nodded, taking notes. What do you think motivated Karen Mitchell to do what she did? Power, probably. And money, obviously, given that she was embezzling. But I think it was mostly about control. She'd convinced herself that she was doing what was best for the community, and that justified anything she did. She became so used to making decisions for other people that she couldn't handle someone saying no to her. Do you have any regrets about how this played out? I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Richard Henderson destroyed his career over something this stupid. I regret that a lot of families lost money on permits they thought were legitimate. But do I regret standing up for my rights? No. Never. The article ran the following Sunday under the headline, "When HOAs Go Too Far, a Local Property Rights Battle." It was fair and well-researched. Sarah included perspectives from legal experts on property law, comments from HOA board members about the reforms they had implemented, and even a statement from Karen's public defender about how she was taking responsibility for her actions. The article generated some discussion online and in local circles. A few people reached out to tell me about their own HOA horror stories. It was eye-opening how common these disputes were, though most didn't escalate to criminal charges like mine had. One message stuck with me. It was from a man in a neighboring county who'd been fighting his HOA for 3 years over a fence they claimed violated architectural standards, even though he'd gotten written approval before building it. He'd spent over $20,000 in legal fees and still hadn't resolved it. "Reading your story gave me hope," he wrote. "I'm not crazy for fighting this. They're actually in the wrong, and sometimes the system does work." I sent him Marcus's contact information. As fall turned to winter, life settled into a comfortable routine. The pond froze over in January, looking beautiful under a layer of ice and snow. No one tried to ice fish on it, which I appreciated. I started thinking about the future of the property. I was in my mid-30s, single, and not sure how long I'd stay in Virginia. Eventually, I might want to sell. When that time came, I wanted to make sure the next owner understood exactly what they were buying and what rights they had. I contacted Marcus about creating a detailed property rights document that could transfer with the deed. It would explain the history of the pond dispute, the court rulings, and the clear establishment that no easement or community rights existed. Future owners wouldn't have to rediscover all of this the hard way. "That's actually smart," Marcus said. "A lot of property disputes happen because of ambiguity or lost history. Making it explicitly clear protects everyone." We drafted the document and had it notarized. I also updated my property survey to include the fence line and gate installation. Everything was documented, filed, and ready for whenever I might need it. In March, I got an unexpected visitor. A man in his 60s knocked on my door on a Saturday morning. He introduced himself as Daniel Carpenter. "I'm the one who sold you this property," he said. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by. I was in the area and wanted to see how the old place was doing." I invited him in for coffee. Daniel had a friendly, weathered face and the kind of relaxed demeanor that comes from retirement. "I heard about your troubles with the HOA," he said, after we'd settled at my kitchen table. "I wanted to apologize. I had no idea they were doing that with the pond." "You didn't know?" He shook his head firmly. "Never. I lived here for 23 years and never saw anyone fishing there or using the property. If they were doing it, they must have been sneaky about it, or it started after I'd already decided to sell." Karen Mitchell claimed previous owners never complained, implying that gave them some kind of right. Daniel laughed, but it was bitter. "Karen Mitchell tried to get me to join her HOA 3 different times over the years. I told her the same thing each time. This property predates your subdivision. It's not part of your association, and I'm not interested." She didn't like hearing no. That tracks with everything I learned about her. She was always trying to expand her little kingdom. A few years back, she tried to claim that the road accessing this property was a private HOA road and that I needed to pay maintenance fees to use it. I had to get a lawyer to show her the county records proving it was a public easement. This was news to me. She tried this kind of thing before? Multiple times with multiple people. Most folks just paid her to avoid the hassle. I think that's how she got away with it for so long. She'd push boundaries, and if people pushed back hard, she'd retreat. If they didn't, she'd take a mile. We talked for over an hour. Daniel shared stories about the property, the changes in the area over the decades, and his experiences living there. It was clear he'd loved the place. "I'm glad it went to someone who stands up for themselves," he said as he was leaving. "I worried about selling to someone who'd just roll over for that HOA. You did good, Adam." After he left, I felt validated in a way I hadn't expected. The previous owner confirmed what I'd believed all along. The HOA had been wrong, had likely been lying, and had a history of this kind of behavior. Spring brought new life to the property. The trees budded, wildflowers bloomed along the pond's edge, and I saw more wildlife than I had during the winter months. Ducks landed on the pond. A blue heron started visiting regularly. I even spotted a family of deer drinking at the water's edge one early morning. I thought about what I wanted to do with all of this space. 5 acres was a lot of land for one person. I considered getting some chickens, maybe building a workshop, planting a larger garden. The possibilities were endless, and they were all mine to decide. That was the real prize of this whole ordeal. Not winning the legal battle, not getting the settlement money, but having the freedom to make my own choices about my own property. One evening in April, I was grilling dinner on the back porch when I noticed someone standing at the fence line. It was a kid, maybe 10 or 11 years old, just staring at the pond. I walked over. "Hey there, can I help you?" The kid looked startled, then embarrassed. "Sorry, sir. I wasn't going to come on your property. I just wanted to see the pond. My dad used to bring me fishing here before everything happened." I felt a pang of sympathy. "What's your name?" "Tommy." "Tommy, I'm Adam. This is a complicated situation, and I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of it. My dad said the HOA lady lied to everyone. He said she stole money, and that's why we can't fish here anymore." "That's pretty much accurate, yeah." Tommy looked at the pond with obvious longing. "It was my favorite place. Dad and I would come on Saturday mornings. He taught me how to cast here." I thought about it for a moment. The principle was important, but so was not punishing a kid for adults' mistakes. "Tommy, where do you live?" He pointed to a house a few streets into the subdivision. "And your dad, is he a good guy? Not involved with the old HOA board?" "He hated them. He always said they were too controlling." I made a decision. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you and your dad permission to fish here, just you two, and you have to ask first each time. If I say yes, you can come. If I'm not home or I say no, you respect that. Deal?" Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Are you serious?" "Dead serious. But this doesn't extend to anyone else, and if I find out people are sneaking on without permission, even you and your dad lose access. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Go get your dad and bring him over. I want to meet him and explain the rules." Tommy ran off at full speed. 10 minutes later, he returned with his father, a tired-looking man in his early 40s who introduced himself as Brian Walsh. "Mr. Aldridge, you didn't have to do this," Brian said, clearly touched. "I know, but your son seems like a good kid, and I remember what it was like having a place like this when I was his age. Just follow the rules, respect the property, and we won't have any problems." "We will, absolutely. And sir, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about everything you went through with the HOA. A lot of us had no idea what Karen was really doing." "I know, it's in the past now." I watched Tommy and Brian walk back toward the subdivision, Tommy talking excitedly the whole way. It felt good to do something positive after all the conflict. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally saw them fishing, always respectful, always cleaning up after themselves. Tommy would wave whenever he saw me. It was a small thing, but it made the property feel less like a battleground and more like a home. As summer approached, I reflected on everything that had happened since I'd moved in. It had been a wild year, full of stress and conflict I never anticipated. But I'd stood my ground, protected my rights, and helped expose corruption in the process. The pond remained private, the property remained mine, and the HOA had learned a very expensive lesson about respecting boundaries. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the water, and think about how different things could have gone. If I'd been less stubborn, if I'd just let it slide, if I'd decided it wasn't worth the fight, Karen would still be running her scams, Richard would still be practicing law, the HOA members would still be getting ripped off. But I did fight. I documented everything, followed the law, and refused to back down when threatened. In the end, Justice prevailed. It didn't always work out that way, I knew, but this time it did. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Saw the article in the Law Journal about your case. It's being cited as a good example of property rights enforcement and HOA accountability. You made case law, buddy. I smiled. Maybe something good would come from all this beyond my personal victory. Maybe other people facing similar situations would have legal precedent to point to. Maybe HOAs would think twice before pulling stunts like this. Or maybe not. People in positions of minor authority had a way of convincing themselves they were right, no matter what the law said. But at least I'd done my part. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, walked back out to the porch, and settled into my chair. The evening was warm, the pond was calm, and for the first time since moving in, everything felt truly peaceful. This was mine. All of it. And no one was going to take it away. A blue heron landed at the water's edge, graceful and patient, waiting for fish. I watched it for a while, enjoying the simple beauty of the moment. In the distance, I could hear kids playing in the subdivision, families cooking dinner, the normal sounds of a community going about its business. They were living their lives, and I was living mine, with clear boundaries between the two. That's how it should be. As darkness fell and stars began to appear, I thought about Tommy and Brian, about Jennifer Wu working to rebuild the HOA's reputation, about Karen sitting in prison contemplating her choices, about Richard Henderson trying to rebuild a career he'd destroyed for a petty power play. Everyone had faced consequences for their actions. That felt right. I finished my beer, took one last look at the pond reflecting the moonlight, and headed inside. Tomorrow was Sunday. Maybe I'd do some fishing myself. In my own pond, on my own property, because it was my right to do so, and that right had been hard-won and well-defended. The end.